Humans are the smartest creatures on Earth, but they've always been pretty stupid. It's the specific things that we're stupid about that changes as years go by.
Before the summer of love, people had some pretty unusual ideas about the world and what the future might hold. Pregnancy can cause all kinds of weird body problems, and that includes constipation.
And if I don't ever poop again, well, that's just going to be who I am.
Today, you have to eat healthy or possibly take a fiber supplement to relieve discomfort. But years ago, doctors didn't bother with any of that healthy lifestyle mumbo jumbo. Instead, they advised pregnant women to smoke cigarettes. Alan F. Guttmacher, a legit gynecologist and obstetrician, said as much in his book, Pregnancy and Birth. On top of that, he also said, "There is no logical reason to prohibit the moderate use of alcohol during pregnancy to the patient who enjoys and tolerates it." The biggest thing Guttmacher wanted moms to avoid was unsightly weight gain, which he wanted to be limited to 20 pounds. And if an expectant mom was starting to get heavy, try skipping lunch and substitute skimmed milk with a few unsalted crackers. Nothing is more important than keeping your hot pregnant bod, right? Just another reason to keep up your smoking habits before your baby bump gets out of control. So if you were born in the late 60s and came out a little weird, you probably have this guy to blame. After pumping a baby full of more cigarettes and booze than Tom Waits, what else can you do to your kid to make them a good, healthy American? According to Dr. Walter W. Sackett Jr., the very first thing you should worry about after giving birth was the spread of communism. In his 1962 book, Bringing Up Babies, Sackett felt that breast milk or formula weren't enough for a newborn, so babies should start eating cereal within 2 days of escaping the womb. By 9 weeks, a baby should be able to chow down on whatever else the family would normally eat, which was apparently mostly booze, cigarettes, and anything that would fit into one of those newfangled microwaves. Sackett wasn't completely crazy. He did recommend waiting until a baby was 6 months old before starting with black coffee. And when your baby cries at night, because its blood is basically 90% coffee now, don't even think about coddling it. Sackett insisted that a baby had to learn to suffer, and soothing a crying baby was, very literally, sowing the seeds of socialism. With one lullaby, you can throw off the global balance of power, and everyone knows that in communist Russia, baby has you. Even though video games are a multi-billion-dollar industry today and heroic fat plumbers have become global phenomenon, the seeds of the industry didn't even exist until 1967. That was when Ralph Baer assembled a prototype for the first home game system. Baer worked for a TV company, and though he tried to sell them on the idea of including a game system with their televisions, all but one of his bosses was dismissive. Video games seemed pretty stupid to most of the executives, though he got a little money to produce a prototype. After all, who'd want to play a game on a TV when you had all the thrills of Monkey's Uncle?
You're a monkey's uncle. It's wild! Complete with stunt mats, cards, horns, clickers, tricks, spinner, and monkey timer.
Patents were filed by 1971, and the device was sold to Magnavox, who sold it as the Odyssey. Unfortunately, by the time the system debuted, Atari's Pong stole all their glory, making headway through the taboo against TV gaming, which would totally never ever become popular. Psychiatrist Walter Freeman thought he came across a life-changing medical procedure when he did his first ice pick lobotomy in 1946. See, Freeman figured that depression and mood problems were caused by having too much emotion, so he wanted to cut the emotional connection in the brain, literally. So, if you were feeling a little crazy, he took a metal rod and gently jammed it through your eye socket into your brain while you were still awake. If that sounds like a Mortal Kombat fatality, well, it's not too far off. For obvious reasons, people did tend to be much calmer or changed after the procedure, as anyone would be when they're left paralyzed or mentally disabled from a traumatic brain injury. Because there were so few reliable sources and medications available for the mentally ill at the time, it seemed like a great idea. Freeman traveled the country in a van he called the Lobotomobile, and even though an alarming proportion of his patients died along the way, that didn't stop people from coming. This went on until 1967, when he performed a lobotomy on a housewife who later died of a brain hemorrhage. That's when it was finally decided that he'd killed just a few too many people. He was forced to stop poking people's brains, and while lobotomies are still practiced today, they're done a little more carefully. Just make sure your doctor isn't named Scorpion or something. Laser technology was only just developing, and a lot of what was predicted in the 1967 documentary, The Laser, A Light Fantastic, actually came true. We're now regularly using lasers for surgery and tattoo removal just as predicted.
Laser surgery is still highly experimental. By the 21st century, a searing beam of laser light may join the scalpel as an essential surgical tool.
But they got one thing very, very wrong. In the late 60s, investors assumed that they'd need something to tackle the major epidemic of typewriter typos. The answer? Lasers. Like the world's most boring sci-fi ray gun, the functional laser eraser would kind of blast a single letter right off the face of a piece of paper without damaging the paper itself. Understandably, this was a pretty big deal when people actually typed stuff with ink instead of pixels. Lasers work their magic, and before you know it, it's like your dumb floppy fingers never even typed that extra E in the first place.
By golly, it works.
It does. All we need to do is miniaturize it and get it into mass production.
Your lowly secretarial job is saved, and it only took 10 minutes and harnessing the most advanced technology that the 60s had to offer. Thanks, lasers.
History is full of crazy weight loss devices, but the craziest might be the vibrating belt workout machine, which was supposed to jiggle the fat off while you just stood there. According to the Orange County Register, the vibrating belt machine was a must-have device in fitness centers for decades, although most health experts knew they were essentially useless. Still, people have continued to find variations on this device rather irresistible over the years.
Introducing the revolutionary Vibro Action Belt. Just turn it on and it will literally vibrate the fat away from your abs.
Deep down, people really want to believe there's some magical technique that will help us drop those extra pounds without having to focus on diet and regular exercise. You probably wouldn't be too surprised if you were told that many male executives hired secretaries based on their looks in the 1960s. But airlines really took that notion to the extreme. You see, there's a reason most flight attendants can't stand being called stewardesses nowadays. According to Vanity Fair, the word stewardess harkens back to a time when attending to people on a flight basically boiled down to looking awesome in a miniskirt.
Feeding and caring for a plane load of passengers can be as glamorous as a stint behind the counter at the 5 and 10.
In those days, you could get a job as a stewardess only if you were between the ages of 20 and 27 and happened to weigh no more than 140 pounds. Oh, and you had to be at least 5'2", but no taller than 5'9". Oh, and you needed to be unmarried and childless too. Basically, you had to be conventionally attractive and potentially available.
Stewardesses, like jetliners, must be slinky sex symbols. Pilots can be homely and bald.
Job training included lessons on how to walk seductively and how to put on your makeup. Meanwhile, you reportedly had to retire at the age of 32, if not long before then.
The stewardess works an average of 18 months, then quits, just a year and a half. Some get married, frequently to passengers.
50 years ago, people thought seatbelts were annoying and oppressive. In fact, most people didn't even want them in their cars. According to Second Chance Garage, customers were so fed up with seatbelts by 1949 that many people would actually cut them out of their cars with razor blades. By the early 1960s, seatbelts were offered as optional equipment on the vast majority of American cars, but that didn't really change anything. Most people simply didn't want them, and even people who had them in their cars tended not to use them. By 1966, only about 30% of the cars on the road in America had seatbelts, and approximately 44% of the people driving those cars used them full-time. In 1968, the powers that be finally passed a law requiring seatbelts as standard equipment in all cars, but that didn't really change anything. This wasn't just because people didn't like the idea of seatbelts. Reportedly, some auto manufacturers were accused of designing the belts to be uncomfortable, as sort of a nose-thumb to government regulations. That persistent hostility was largely the reason it took so long for anyone to actually pass real laws. The first mandatory seatbelt law didn't reach the books until the mid-1980s, and that was only in New York at first. As the New York Times reported on December 1, 1984, New York State's mandatory seatbelt law, the first in the nation, went into effect today. Drivers and front seat passengers must wear seatbelts or face fines up to $50.
Fasten your seatbelt, please.
Throughout the 60s, teenage girls were spoon-fed some terrible advice. In 1967, 17 published a whole book of etiquette entitled The 17 Book of Fashion and Beauty, which advised young women that good speech is more important than the actual words you say. The sound, the smile, the gentleness, warmth, and vitality. The voice that says, "I like people, I like you." Meanwhile, the book also offered this not-so-cheerful tip. If a girl slumps her shoulders, it's a safe bet she hopes nobody will notice anything about her. Probably nobody will. Women in the 1960s were basically expected to be subservient to their husbands.
Oh, this coffee is criminal.
Honey, you killed the petunias.
According to Little Things, women could refer to a number of manuals in order to clarify whose needs came first. Spoiler alert, the needs of the husband came first.
Try the coffee.
Coffee? Oh, your coffee's always a real treat.
For example, Housekeeping Monthly's article, The Good Wife's Guide, instructed women to have a delicious meal ready on time for your husband's return. Also, the article suggested that women should always touch up your makeup, put a ribbon in your hair, and be fresh looking. Meanwhile, the article assured that catering for his comfort will provide you with immense personal satisfaction. In conclusion, yikes.
Harold, is the coffee all right? You mean it's as bad as yesterday?
In the early 1990s, things were different. People watched Bill Cosby portraying a beloved family man and sweater aficionado on TV. The idea of the Chicago Cubs winning a World Series seemed impossible. Street Sharks were going to live forever.
Half shark, half man, fighting evil, that's the plan. Street Sharks.
Let's look at some other things we believed back then that turned out to be wronger than wrong. In 1992, the FDA unveiled a food pyramid to explain to ever-widening Americans what they should eat. The bottom of the food pyramid suggested eating 6 to 11 servings a day of carbs, and that fats and oils should be consumed sparingly. This super high carb, very low fat diet was considered the way to good health and losing weight.
Fettuccine Alfredo. Time to carbo load.
One of the biggest figures pushing this sort of diet was Susan Powter, with her Stop the Insanity weight loss crusade, which emphasized this diet. Except she was wrong, and according to Time magazine, her emphasis on processed, low-fat foods that were high in sugar only caused people to gain weight. Basically, this pyramid only contained a curse.
There's sugar, salt, nachos, hot dogs, corn dogs, all the dog foods.
Since then, the FDA has made several revisions to their food recommendations, most recently in 2011, emphasizing making the most of your veggies and fruits and reducing your carb and grain intake. This idea was backed up by a 2014 National Institutes of Health study that showed people lost more body fat on a low-carb diet than a low-fat one. The idea of filling up on white bread, rice, and cereal is completely outdated. So don't stop the insanity, stop the unlimited breadsticks at Olive Garden. In 1974, Action Comics 1 was worth $400. By 1984, its value had shot up to $5,000, and by 1991, it was going for $82,500. And that wasn't the only comic book increasing in value. Detective Comics number 27, Batman's debut, sold for $55,000 in 1991. Nowhere to go but up, right?
We'll also take you to the brave new world of comic books. They are bigger, they're wilder, and they aren't just for kids anymore.
Comic speculation made everyone go a little crazy, buying issues they hoped would one day be worth a mint, just like Batman's first adventures. And for a while in the early 90s, even recently published comics were increasing in value. Comic stores popped up everywhere to meet the demand of buyers, and new publishers emerged. But by 1992, the industry had peaked. The market became flooded with hundreds of comics that just about everybody owned, making them essentially worthless. Quality dipped, artists started drawing heroes with too many teeth and not enough bones, and by 1993, the exploding industry collapsed. Classic comics retained their value, but comics from the 90s never really did. One of the most shocking announcements in sports happened in 1991, when Magic Johnson revealed that he was HIV positive and was retiring from the Lakers immediately. Then, contracting AIDS was considered to be a death sentence. It was also thought of as a disease that only affected gay men, so Johnson revealing he was ill was shocking. It seemed like AIDS was going to become an even more widespread epidemic in America. However, not only is Johnson still alive, but he's healthy as a horse. AIDS, meanwhile, would become a treatable disease in the United States, thanks to drug therapy. According to the Centers for Disease Control, about 1.2 million people in the U.S. are living with the disease today, and the number of diagnosed cases declined 19% between 2005 to 2014.
Millions of infections have been prevented, And around the world, people with HIV are living full and healthy lives with the dignity and respect they deserve.
While people still do die from complications from AIDS, it's no longer the automatic death sentence it once was.
Please listen very carefully. A swarm of killer bees is coming this way.
Most people know now that bees are really important to our ecosystem, and their death, thanks to pesticides, parasites, and disease, is a pretty big deal, since they're fairly essential for plant life, and we use plants for, well, everything. But in the early 1990s, people feared bees, especially the dreaded Africanized honeybees. Appropriate to their name, the honeybees were imported from Africa to Brazil in the 1950s and were expected to thrive since they were already used to the climate. The bees were ultimately called killer bees and swarmed around the world until arriving in the US in the 1990s.
Get off my sugar! Bad bees! Bad! Ow! Ow! Oh, they're defending themselves somehow!
When they did arrive in the US, several people did die from being stung by them, which caused concern that the bees would go on a rampage and kill many more people. The reputation of killer bees was that they were extra large and extra lethal, but the reality is that they were both smaller and less venomous. They're also more likely to sting and pursue targets for longer distances than regular bees do, so the threat is real. But today, we know that the dreaded killer bee threat never took over all of America, mostly because it never really existed.
Beads.
Bees?
Beads.
Beads?
Crime was a huge issue in the early 90s, and with the predicted decay of major urban areas, super predators became a legitimate 90s fear. You know every 80s movie about gangs of roving, depraved teenagers ruling vast cities and committing remorseless brutality? This was once a genuine concern.
They are not just gangs of kids anymore. They are often the kinds of kids that are called super predators. No conscience, no empathy.
Criminologists described a bloodbath of violence that was going to destroy the country. John DeLulio Jr., a political scientist, warned that youth crime and violence was hurting the inner city, and that it would inevitably spill out into suburban areas, and even into those places that have, no cell service. So not only would we have to deal with street gangs, but farm gangs as well. So you may be wondering why we're all not living in a 24/7 cesspool of death and crime. Instead of a meteoric rise, crime dropped rapidly in the 90s, and America generally became safer. The super predator went extinct, and America found brand new imaginary things to fear.
Do you want to destroy humans? Please say no.
Okay, I will destroy humans.
No, I take it back.
In 2007, we were eagerly awaiting new movies in the Pirates of the Caribbean and Spider-Man franchises. Beyoncé and Rihanna topped the charts, and everyone was wrapped up in the drama of the sexy doctors on Grey's Anatomy. So life today might not seem that different from our lives back then, but 2007 wasn't exactly the same as it is now. With a headline that they'll probably regret for the rest of its days, technology site TechCrunch confidently announced in 2006, "We predict the iPhone will bomb." It's a classic Dewey defeats Truman type of headline that will go down as one of the most wrong-headed predictions ever made. Now, TechCrunch wasn't insane. When the iPhone first came out, it seemed ridiculous that a phone would have so many extraneous uses. Sure, checking your email on your phone is great, but what else would anyone want to do on the thing? Conan O'Brien even ran a sketch making fun of the phone's many uses, starring a before-she-was-famous Ellie Kemper.
It's lip gloss, a condiment dispenser, mace.
But why was TechCrunch so sure the iPhone would be a disaster? Well, they thought the glass would crack too much. They figured people would just buy iPods instead, and they found the iPhone virtual keyboard laughable, saying that virtual keyboard will be about as useful for tapping out emails and text messages as a rotary phone. Don't be surprised if a sizable contingent of iPhone buyers express some remorse at ditching their BlackBerry when they spend an extra hour each day pumping out emails on the road. That did not happen. In 2007, Brian Williams ran a story about predictions for America's future 10 years down the line. Since it was coming from Brian Williams, you knew it had to be true and very trustworthy. It's Brian Williams, America's favorite newsman. He certainly wouldn't exaggerate a story for dramatic effect or outright lie to the American public. Anyway, the segment focused mainly on how technology would change in a decade's time. It predicted that everyone in the country would have a cybernetic implant containing all their personal data.
The year is 2017. You're rushed to a hospital unconscious with no ID or medical history, but thanks to a microchip under your skin, it's all there.
Other predictions about widespread use of facial recognition technology and invasive marketing techniques were at least a little closer to reality. But so far, Williams is still striking out on those crazy stories. Radiohead made a bold move with the release of their album In Rainbows. Before selling physical CDs, they'd sell digital downloads, and the customer would pay whatever they wanted for the album. For some in the media, this kind of anarchy spelled the end of music as we know it. The Sunday Times declared it the day the music industry died, while The Guardian pronounced it a death knell for up-and-coming artists who would never be able to afford to essentially give their music away for free. Of course, they were wrong. The In Rainbow stunt had almost no impact on the industry, but letting fans play songs for free on YouTube and services like Spotify has become the norm. TechCrunch had kind of a rough time in 2007. After declaring the iPhone was doomed, they doubled down on bad predictions by insisting that websites like Facebook and Wikipedia, which rely on user-generated content, were doomed because people are just too lazy to keep posting this crap. Citing the failures of Friendster and MySpace as proof, they reasoned that people would get tired of updating their profiles and return to their real lives instead. Wrong again. TechCrunch obviously didn't realize that for most people, social media is their real life now.